How does Stephen Hawking have sex? Enter backspace, enter backspace, enter backspace. Tried kidnapping Stephen Hawking the other day. Had the blindfold the bastard so he'd stop yelling for help. How does Stephen Hawking take a crap? He logs out. If Stephen Hawking, given his physical ailments, were to develop a machine to help him masturbate, would it be a stroke of genius? I just tried to woo Stephen Hawking, but I don't think I pushed the right buttons. What is the most common phrase used by Stephen Hawking? Screw you, autocorrect. What's the difference between Stephen Hawking and a walkie-talkie? Stephen Hawking doesn't walkie or talkie. So Stephen Hawking walks in a bar. Just kidding. How did Stephen Hawking die? He accidentally hit Alt plus F4. What if Stephen Hawking was the real Slim Shady, but you would never know because he can't stand up? Did Stephen Hawking have a donor card? Cause I really need bits for my kids' go-kart. There is no God. Stephen Hawking. 2011. There is no Stephen Hawking God. 2018. What's with all of the rude Stephen Hawking jokes? The man can't even stand up for himself. Stephen Hawking diagnosed with erectile dysfunction. It was easy to fix. They just uninstalled his pop-up blocker. Stephen Hawking is a terrible role model for our kids. He only looks one way when crossing the street. I've tried calling Stephen Hawking many times. I keep getting his answering machine. What's Stephen Hawking's least favorite song? Stairway to Heaven. What's the difference between Stephen Hawking and the computer he's hooked up to? The computer runs. What do you call Stephen Hawking rolling away from an explosion? Hot Wheels. First joke, hope you like it. What were Stephen Hawking's last words? Control-Alt-Delete. A fish, a snake, and Stephen Hawking walk into a bar. Just kidding. None of those things walk. Stephen Hawking was quite persistent in his older age. He never walked away from a challenge. What do you call a handjob from Stephen Hawking? A stroke of genius. How does Stephen Hawking refresh after a long day? F5. They just released Stephen Hawking's last words. 1% battery life remaining. Please find nearest charger and plug-in device. What's the opposite of Stephen Hawking? Stephen Walking. Why does Stephen Hawking date African Americans? Because he loves to study black holes. What did Stephen Hawking say when his computer crashed? Nothing. Stephen Hawking had his first date for 10 years last week. He came back, his glasses were smashed, he had a broken wrist, a twisted ankle and grazed knees. Apparently she stood him up. First Stephen Hawking, now Avicii. Tough year for the electronic community. Sometimes I feel like Stephen Hawking in the morning because I can't get out of bed. Stephen Hawking is a very paranoid man. He's always looking over his shoulder. Stephen Hawking. So Stephen Hawking went out on a date with someone, but the date ended early because she stood him up. Why can't Stephen Hawking become a stand-up comedian? Because he's dead. Why did Stephen Hawking only eat meat? Because eating vegetables would be cannibalism. Stephen Hawking's final theory, written just before he died, was released yesterday. It's about time. Why is Stephen Hawking successful? He can't run away from his responsibilities. Everyone is a fan of Stephen Hawking now that he died. I bet they can't name even 3 of his songs. Who would win in a fight between Muhammad Ali and Stephen Hawking? Parkinson's. Stephen Hawking seems to be a very emotional person. He is even moved by his chair. My friend said they'd finally read Stephen Hawking's book. I said, it's about time. Just saw a post about Stanley, Avicii, Stephen Hawking and Burt Reynolds. It was a rip post. Stephen Hawking. If Stephen Hawking started a company, what would his position in the company be? The chairman. Have you seen Stephen Hawking's new communication device? It really speaks for itself. Did you hear about Stephen Hawking? His computer suffered a fatal error. Why does Stephen Hawking only use one-liners? Because he can't do stand-up. Till Stephen Hawking is British. Never realized because of his accent. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking, and Bill Nye walk into a bar. Neil and Bill look at Stephen Hawking and yell, "My God, Stephen, you're cured." What do you get when you combine Richard Simmons with Stephen Hawking? A fruit and a vegetable. Why did Stephen Hawking get deferred from the cryogenics lab? Because the doctors knew you should freeze vegetables. How do we know it's Stephen Hawking talking and not just the black box? There are no ads. Stephen Hawking says we only have 1,000 more years left as a civilization. He's just mad that we haven't figured out how to get him out of that wheelchair by now. Stephen Hawking is an inspiration. He's earned millions in the past 10 years without lifting a finger. What do Evel Knievel and Stephen Hawking have in common? Their love of ramps. Billy Graham and Stephen Hawking meet each other in the afterlife. That was amazing. Billy says to Stephen, "It sure was, let's do that again. Only this time I get to be the bad cop." How does Stephen Hawking commit suicide? Alt F4. Did you hear about Dr. Stephen Hawking? News report I saw this morning describing horrible injuries to Dr. Stephen Hawking, like a broken jaw, damaged collarbone, smashed kneecaps. Apparently his date last night stood him up. What's Stephen Hawking's least favorite kind of comedy? Stand-up. Stephen Hawking can actually be pretty funny sometimes, but I don't think he's got what it takes to do stand-up. How do you know Stephen Hawking has jungle fever? He knows a lot about black holes. Did you know that Stephen Hawking wrote a cookbook? It's called A Brief History of Time. Why is Stephen Hawking going to hell? Because it's a stairway to heaven, not a ramp. What is Stephen Hawking's favorite song? Satisfaction. Have you seen the new Stephen Hawking's movie? They say it's too good you won't be able to move from your seat the entire film. Do you know if Stephen Hawking still has his old phone number? Every time I call, a machine answers. Why doesn't Stephen Hawking need a wife? Because he has his own shoulder